Thank you for coming on this beautiful November drizzly day. We're going to present a few sort of selected stories of Goose Pond and some of its history today. These are topics that are derived from my book, Reflections on Goose Pond, which I published in May. The talk will be about 45 minutes long, roughly. And I want to have you free to raise your hands or speak up if you have questions or comments at any point during it. I hope we'll have a little time afterwards at the end to have a conversation if we need to do that. Thank you. After the presentation, I have books available for those who would like to purchase it, and I will sign them for you. Just know that all profits from sales of the book are donated to support the Appalachian Trail Hiker Cabin on Upper Goose Pond, which we'll talk a little bit about. So before we start, I wanted to just say a few words about this absolutely beautiful postcard that's on the screen here. This postcard was mailed on March 5th, 1907 from Nick to Parks Hamblin in Brooklyn. The view is of Upper Goose Pond from a vantage point near the channel opening. And if you look closely, there's a name on the boat is called the Madge, who would have been the boat belonging to Madge Caverly, who built one of the first cabins on Goose Pond in 1901. Parks Hamblin, who received this postcard in Brooklyn, would later become one of the founders of the Mohicana Club in 1909, which we're going to talk a little bit about as well. One of the things that's really unique about this card, other than the fact that it's just a beautiful postcard, if you look at the bottom, it says Goose Pond or Lake May. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, but Goose Pond was for a period of time in the 1800s called Lake May. And this was the only document I found in all my research that included both names on the same document. So it was just kind of interesting. Just get used to my controls here. So there's absolutely gorgeous handwriting around the outside of this postcard, which we don't see handwriting like that anymore. And I was able to decipher it, and it reads, Dear Parks, have just sent one of these to Paul. Doesn't this look natural, though? Can you picture yourself with a rod and line from the rocks and a box of crickets? Nick. I just love that card. So before we start, for those of you that are not perhaps familiar with Goose Pond, I think it's important to get a feel for the geography and some of the landmarks, because there's going to be a lot of content on the layout of Goose Pond. If you look at it, it's actually two lakes. There's the larger lake over here, which is Lower Goose Pond, and then the smaller lake up here called Upper Goose Pond. And they're connected by a small channel, which was hand dug in 1839, and we're going to talk about how that came to be also. You'll see the town line here between Lee and Tyringham, so you see most of it falls in Lee, but the far ends are in the town of Tyringham. The other landmarks I just want to point out is that there's a dam on the lake down here. We're going to talk about the history of the dam, and then it drains into the Goose Pond stream. This is kind of just a rough drawing just to show that it flows in this general direction northward. And so this is the Goose Pond stream. We're going to talk about that. And Forest Street, which is the road that goes up along the stream. And then it joins Route 20 here and the Greenwater Stream. So and this junction is going to be a point of some history here as well. So I just wanted to just get people to understand some of the layout here if they're not familiar with it. I also think it's important to understand some of the topography of Goose Pond. So we're here in Lee, which is in the valley. We're at an elevation of about 900 feet in Lee. This is the Tyringham Valley here. Lenox is up here. This mountain here is called Long Mountain, which is long. It runs in a north-south direction from Lee down towards Otis, and it's bordered on by Tyringham Valley, Hop Brook in this section, and it's a western branch of the Farmington River on this side. And Goose Pond is right here where the blue arrow is. And you can see Goose Pond is a mountaintop lake. It sits right at the summit of Long Mountain at an elevation of about 1,470 feet. So there's about a 500-foot drop from here to Lee, which you'll see is instrumental in a lot of Goose Pond's history. And just for orientation, here's Beartown State Forest, to the west, and to the north is October Mountain. So you can see here is just, this is a wall of the western margin of the Berkshire Mountains, just outside of Lee. So those of you that have driven up and down Forest Street or biked it or walked it, you're going to see this building. This is what remains of the last paper mill to operate on the Goose Pond stream. And before we discuss this particular mill's story, I think it's important to know that it's just one of many paper mills in Lee and one of many paper mills on the Goose Pond stream as well. Back in around 1800, the Berkshire Mountains were very attractive to the paper mill industry in the Boston area. And part of that is because of the water power derived from the Housatonic River, and particularly the stream, as I mentioned, that drops from Goose Pond into Lee, drops 500 feet, 500 vertical feet in 2 miles, which was considered then to be maybe unique in the state of Massachusetts for the rapidity of the drop of altitude. And that was an important motivation for the paper mill industry to come to the Berkshires in general and Lee in particular. The other reason why paper mills came to the Berkshires is the availability of rags. So you all heard how newspapers are sometimes called rags. Well, the reason is that the raw material for creating paper in the early years, in the 1800s, was used rags, cotton and linen rags. And in Boston, the paper mills were so short of this raw material that they actually imported rags from Europe. So, which is like an amazing thing. You get like some dirty rags from Europe and you put it on a ship and ship it to here. But that's how important the rags were. And so the Berkshires was sort of an untapped source of rags at that time. Obviously, land was cheaper here than it was in Boston, and it had robust railroad routes already, and the Hudson River to get their paper product to New York, which was the primary market for Berkshire papers. So Zenas Crane, at the age of 22, opened the first paper mill in the Berkshires in 1800. That was in Dalton, on 14 acres that he purchased for $194. You can't get deals like that anymore. So in 1806, Samuel Church opened the second paper mill in the Berkshires, which was in South Lee, and that's now the site of the Onyx Specialty Papers, which still operates as you drive towards Stockbridge. And then his brother, Lumen Church, opened the Eagle Mill in North Lee, which is just a few feet from here, and is now being converted to residential housing. So that was the third paper mill in the Berkshire Mountains. And then in 1819, Lumen Church opened the Forest Mill, which was at the confluence of the Goose Pond and Greenwater streams, right where Route 20 and Forest Street intersect. That's no longer standing. The first paper mill on Goose Pond stream proper was built by Sylvester May. And you might recognize that name because of the name Lake May. And he built that in 1837. It burned down in 1839. It was rebuilt in 1840. These mills were always burning down and always getting rebuilt. By the 1840s and 50s, Lee had 25 plus paper mills, and between them, the town of Lee produced 25% of all the paper manufactured in the United States, which is absolutely remarkable, and it earned the name Paper Town, USA for that reason. The Lee mills produced most of the paper consumed in New York City's newspapers, including pretty much all the paper used to print the New York Herald and the New York Tribune. I say all this because the paper mill industry was really critical in a lot of this history that we still live with on Goose Pond. You can see here, this is the mill now. The predecessor to this mill was the Benton Brothers Mill, and I just wanted to point this out on a map from 1876. And I wanted to show you how all these little dots here are paper mills. So this is Forest Street coming up to Goose Pond. This is the Goose Pond stream. Here's Goose Pond. And these are all paper mills up and down here. So I didn't know that. When I started this book, I thought there was one paper mill. That's why it took me 4 years instead of 3 years. These are pictures which I got from the Lee Library Historical Archive. And Mary Philpott, I don't know if Mary, you're here? Mary here?
Yes.
Oh, there you are. Thank you. Mary was so helpful with this. So these are all photographs of paper mills on Forest Street, going on the Goose Pond stream, going up to Goose Pond. This one is the one of the predecessor mills in the site of the current mill, and you can see horse-drawn carriages over here. So I mean, this was a very industrial street for a long time. I think it was called Mountain Road then. I'm not sure when it became Forest Street. These are some pictures of the interior of Berkshire Mills. These are not Lee's Mills. These were in Dalton. But it also shows a little bit how paper was made in those days. So what would happen is they had people from the paper mills would go out into the country and do what they call rag routes. So they would go to farms and businesses and houses and schools, and they would buy old rags or barter for them. And they would bring the rags back to the mill, and it would go into this room, which was called the rag room. It was staffed predominantly by women, and they would take the buttons off, they would open the seams, they would bang the dust out of it, they would sort them by color and quality, and they would cut them into little 2- and 4-inch squares, and then they would deliver these little cut squares of paper to the beater room. This is the beater room. These are called Hollander beaters, which were pretty much unchanged for like 100 years. These were the machines that required the water wheels. These were the only part of the early part of the paper mills that required power. And these were basically tubs of water. And the water would be put in, and then the pieces of rag would be put in, and there was an old tree trunk that would be rotating in there with knives embedded in it, and it would literally rotate for days, grinding up these rags into the pulp. They would call these things engines, and they would call the guy that runs it an engineer. And so these were unchanged for like 100 years. And then that pulp would then be taken to a vat room where the vat man would put them in a metal mesh and shake the water out and interlace the fibers, and then it would be pressed and then dried and then processed. A lot of this became automated with the invention of the Fourdrinier machine, which is here. And the first Fourdrinier machine in the Berkshire Mountains was on the Goose Pond stream by the May brothers. And that combined many of these steps and was able to produce 200 feet of paper every minute. So Herman Melville, who I'm sure all of you know, was in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. He saw a Fourdrinier machine, and he wrote in The Paradise of Bachelors and Tartarus of Maids in 1885 the following: "Something of awe now stole over me as I gazed upon this inflexible iron animal. Always, more or less, machinery of this ponderous, elaborate sort strikes, in some moods, strange dread into the human heart, as some living, panting behemoth might. But what made the thing I saw so specially terrible to me was the metallic necessity, the unbudging fatality which governed it." This is Sylvester May on the left, and he and his brother Edward May worked for 26 years on the Goose Pond stream with multiple mills. They built the dam, and they built this house on the right, which was called Maywood. Each brother had one wing on the left and right, and then a common area. And this house still stands, and you can still see it as you drive up Forest Street. And all of this led to Goose Pond's renaming for most of the 1800s. A lot of people would call it Lake May. This on the left, obviously, is the mill as it is now, and on the right is a sketch of the same mill in 1876 when it was called the Benton Brothers Mill. Because this mill still stands, I wanted to just go through real quickly sort of the chronology of this building. It was built in 1854 by Caleb Benton and Harrison Garfield, and it was then called the Mountain Mill. Like all the mills around those years, it burnt down and was rebuilt. And when Caleb died, it was taken over by his two sons, who called it the Benton Brothers Mill. It had a 30-foot water wheel and produced 1,000 pounds of paper a day. And in the Civil War, produced gun cotton for the Union Army cannons. They sold the mill in 1905 to a group of Lee businessmen who renamed it once again the Mountain Mill. It went through a number of other names over the years. And then in the 1980s and 90s, when I started coming to Goose Pond, it was working 24/7, 365, and manufactured glassine paper, which was food packaging. It was very closely associated to the Lake May Power Company, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute. And it ceased operations in 1994 and donated the dam to the Goose Pond Maintenance District in 1997. If you walk along the side of Forest Street down near the Goose Pond stream in the woods, you still see these structures. So these are stone foundations. They're just beautiful from the old paper mills. And they also built multiple dams up and down the Goose Pond stream to, I guess, deepen the water for their individual water wheels. And you can still see these dams up and down the whole stream. All right, so we'll talk about the dam. This here is the Goose Pond Dam from a drone photograph. Now this is Lower Goose Pond here. It was enlarged to its current size in 1839 by a group of paper mill owners coordinated by the two May brothers. It was strengthened and modified a few times over the years. But the actual origins of the dam I discovered as a result of a dam failure here. This is up here, now called Basin Pond, and many of you may have hiked on that. It's a really nice little trail goes around there, and from Route 20, or from Beckett, I guess, somewhere up in here. So anyway, Mud Pond had its own dam, and in 1886, on April 20th, it failed. There were 7 Lee citizens that died, wiped out the entire White family, except for one son who climbed a tree. And there were 7 deaths. A lot of houses got wiped out. A lot of businesses got wiped out. And the trauma of that to East Lee led local authorities to hire a man named Edward S. Rogers in 1886 to investigate the Mud Pond failure, the dam failure, and to write up his investigation. And he wrote a small book called The Complete Account of the Terrible Disaster at East Lee on Tuesday, April 20th, 1886. And it's a fascinating little book, and there's a chapter in there on the Goose Pond Dam, because I guess he considered that to be part of his investigation. So there's one excerpt here which I'm not going to read, but if you do read through it in some detail, it has an incredible amount of information embedded in it. So this dam, we know, as it was built at the time of 1886, was built in 1839. And if you read through this, you realize that the dam was built on top of stones from an original dam that was built in the 1760s. So we can place the Goose Pond Dam back to before the American Revolution, which I thought was really interesting. There's another excerpt here that solves 2 other issues. One is it points out that the connection between Upper and Lower Goose Pond was man-made, and that's been, in my experience, was something always open to question. But basically, when they expanded the dam in 1839, they also dug the channel between the two lakes and increased the amount of water supply to the dam. And the other thing that is in this excerpt is that the original dam back in the 1760s was built for a single sawmill. And we know from historical documents that, that dam in the 1760s was 12 feet wide and raised Goose Pond by about 18 inches. And we know from historical documents that after the May brothers expanded the dam in 1839, they bought that sawmill and they converted it to the middle mill. So here's a map from 1860 showing the middle mill. So this was the site of the original sawmill from the 1760s that built the first dam. This is what the dam looked like in 1962. This is the downstream face. It had a very vertical stone-lined face, and what it looks like now is much more gradual, earth-filled, and much more sturdy than it was and brought up to current safety standards. So a common question that I've always asked and heard is, what would Goose Pond look like without its dam? And it's very easy to calculate that, because if you take a depth map, this is a map from the Department of Fisheries, and just redraw the borders of the pond at minus 15 feet, you get these blue figures here. And you can see a few things that are really interesting. One is that it's there, so it's not like the dam created the lake. And the connection was dry, so there was no visible connection. So these are definitely two separate lakes that became conjoined. And I drew here an estimation of where the stream would have been draining Goose Pond, and then this is where the dam got built. So how many of you have seen this building? Right, so if you're driving along Route 20 at the Forest Street intersection, you'll see this building up in the woods. And I think it's a really attractive architecturally, but it's abandoned. There's no roof, there's no windows. This is what's left of the Lake May Power Company. In 1922, when it was operating, it looked like this. This was a hydroelectric plant. It was part of two plants. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. It operated for 70-odd years and was actually very innovative in its technology, and it overcame a lot of staffing challenges that other hydroelectric plants in the United States were suffering from. And it allowed them to operate economically soundly for 70 years. And it was allowed to do that because it could be staffed by one mechanic at any one given time. If you go inside the building, which I don't really advise, but I did it, you can see there's no roof, there's no windows, there's no walls, there's plant life growing from all directions. But if you look at this photograph was 1922 of the same room and the same vantage point. And you can see all these beautiful turbines and the electrical control systems over here. Now it looks like this. And in its heyday, it was producing 966,000 kilowatt hours of electricity at 2,300 volts, which today would supply about 90 houses. It was tied into the Lee-Pittsfield electrical grids and had a very fluid relationship with the paper mills upstream from it. And sometimes this paper mills owns Lake May Power, sometimes Lake May Power owned the mills. It was kind of fluid. The formative meeting for the Lake May Power Company by electrical engineers, paper mill owners, and financiers took place in 1895. This is from a publication September 11th, 1895. It didn't get built until 1920. So the people who lived on Goose Pond during the 1900s, like my family, dealt with huge fluctuations in the lake level. There would be floods and droughts, and the water would go up and the water would go down, and you would never know at any given week what the water level was going to be. And that was really a function of the Lake May Power Company. And it's just really interesting, if you're a little bit nerdy like I am, to learn that there were actually two power heads. So the main powerhouse is the one that I showed you the photograph of, the one that you can still see. But downstream, about 1,000 feet downstream, probably where the Eastleigh package store is, there was another powerhouse. And they worked in sequence. So the main powerhouse got all its water from Goose Pond. Then the water would exit that power plant, and it would be joined by water from the Greenwater Pond. You've all seen that between Route 20 and the Mass Pike, and Mud Pond up here. So this was the watershed for the two. And what was really, the way that they worked it is that when it rained hard, when it was a really wet season, they would close the Goose Pond Dam, and they would operate only off the Greenwater Pond water through the lower head here. So you can imagine, and then when it dried, when the rain stopped and we had a dry season, they would open the dam and Goose Pond and use the water from Goose Pond. So you can imagine how it's the opposite of what you would expect a dam to operate. You would think a dam would be opened when it was raining and closed when it's dry, and they actually did the complete opposite. Which is why my father had to have 2x6s to reach his barbecue in the 1970s. So we're going to change gears. I don't know how we are on time. Is there? Oh, I guess we're kind of okay. So I want to talk a little about the land preservation around Goose Pond. So if you look at this map here, this is Goose Pond. The red line here is the Appalachian Trail. I'm sure many of you have seen there or walked on it. The light green shaded plot of land around the Appalachian Trail is currently owned by the National Park Service. So you can see all of Upper Goose Pond is owned by the National Park Service. So there's no development, no road access. The only way in there is by hiking or by boat. And then if you move over to this area of Lower Goose Pond, you have this tract, which is now owned by the trustees of reservations. And they call it the Goose Pond Reservation. I flipped this upside down just to correspond. But now we have this whole section and this whole section completely preserved for posterity. So there were a series of families that allowed this to happen. The Stillwell family descended from William Chipman Stevenson, which we're going to talk about, negotiated with the National Park Service in 1982 that if they wanted to buy their corridor of land around the Appalachian Trail, which is a derivative of the Appalachian Trail Act, passed in 1978, that they would only sell it if they bought all this land. And so we have the Stillwell family to thank for that. And then Henry Wild Smith, which we'll talk about, donated this property to the trustees in 1985. So we have the Smith family, the Stillwell family, Murphy family, and the Mohicana Club, which we'll talk about, to thank for preserving all these properties. So where were these people? So the Smith family had their cabin here in 1916. The Murphy family had their cabin here in 1916. The Stevenson-Stillwell cabin still stands, and that was located here in 1926. And then the Mohicana Club built in 1909. So these four entities were really instrumental in giving us what we have today, which is a really well-preserved natural environment. These are kind of the matriarch and patriarch of Goose Pond. On the left is Annie Foote Smith. This was taken around 1926 on Lower Goose Pond next to her cabin. And then on the right is William Chipman Stevenson in 1906. These pivotal families were not related initially, but they became related when her granddaughter married his grandson. The wedding was in Lenox, and the honeymoon was at the Upper Goose Pond cabin. Of course, they had to swim there to get there because their car got stuck in the mud. These are those cabins. So this is the Murphy cabin on the outside, and this absolutely beautiful photograph is from inside the Murphy cabin looking at Upper Goose Pond. This cabin's no longer standing. It's used as part of the Appalachian Trail hiker cabin now as an overflow camping area. This is the Smith cabin, which no longer stands, and this is the Stillwell cabin that still stands and is still occupied in the summer. This is some of the fun that these families had. This is all from the early 1900s. This is the Stillwell cabin, and Stillwell family. This is the granddaughter that married the Stillwell. This is Carolyn Wild Smith. This is Ted Murphy and Bob Stillwell on the Murphy cabin. This is Carolyn Wild Smith, and I love this. There's a little goose painted on this boat. And then this is Henry Wild Smith, who donated the property many years later to the trustees of reservations. That's Bob Stillwell and Caroline Smith. So then flash forward to 1981, the National Park Service buys all the land around Upper Goose Pond. And then a year later, there was a ceremony on Upper Goose Pond. This is Representative Silvio Oconte, who was our local congressman for many years, and a representative from the Appalachian Mountain Club. This photograph I love. So this is Henry Wild Smith, taken around 1953. He's sitting on a rock in what we call Stump Island on Lower Goose Pond. And I marked with the red arrows this piece of property back here. 30 years later, he would donate this property to the trustees of reservations. So I just think the photograph is so interesting because it seems like a... So once again, this is, you know, all the preserved property that we have now around Goose Pond that we're so blessed for. Change gears to the Mohicana Club, which was located over here. If you go to this site now, this is what you'll see. You'll see a chimney. That's really the only thing left of the club. And it's led to many people to call this club the Chimney Club, which is not what it was called. There's a plaque there now, which stands here. I'll try to read it from here. I can't see it from where I'm standing. Near this site of the shores of Upper Goose Pond stood the Mohicana Club. The club was incorporated in 1909 and for 72 years served to provide its membership with good fellowship and fond memories. In 1981, the club conveyed its lands to the National Park Service and provided the Appalachian Mountain Club with a gift to assure that these lands would remain a wilderness preserve, July 24, 1982. So when the Mohicana Club sold its property to the National Park Service, it donated $12,000 to the Appalachian Mountain Club to run the hiker cabin. It still operates on Upper Goose Pond. And this is what the chimney looked like, the fireplace looked like when it was in operation. This was provided to me by Warren White, who's sitting right over here, who spent his childhood summers at the Mohicana Club. These are members from the Mohicana Club with their banner sitting on the steps. Some external photographs of the building. These are deer hanging from the roof of the porch in the wintertime. And a lot of people call the Mohicana Club a men's club. It was not a men's club, right, Warren? There's plenty of women there. Okay, you can see here, women. I love this one because it shows the chimney that still stands in the woods with a nice little fire in it. Once again, there were women there. They had a lot of music. Warren had told me how they had wind-up phonograph and they'd play music and dancing and banjos. They were like the precursors to the tree huggers. And this looks like, to me, it looks like it's the Wild West in Jackson, Wyoming or something like that. But this is Lee, Massachusetts. All right, we're going to finish with this. This is Grover Cleveland. He was born in 1837 in Caldwell, New Jersey. In 1881, he became mayor of Buffalo. In 1882, he was governor of New York. In 1885, he was the 22nd president of the United States. In 1886, he married Frances Folsom in the Blue Room of the White House with 31 invited guests. In 1893, he was the 24th president of the United States. And in 1901, he fished on Goose Pond. And in 1906, he returned to Goose Pond. Grover Cleveland was the first Democratic president after the Civil War. He was the first president to get married in the White House. He was one of only 2 presidents elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. We know who the other one is. And he's the only U.S. president known to have fished on Goose Pond. How he came to Goose Pond was through his friendship with this man over here, who is Richard Watson Gilder. This photograph is the funeral of Ulysses Grant in New York in 1885. Gilder is carrying a poem that he wrote that he read at the Grant funeral, and then behind him is Grover Cleveland. So they were long-term friends for many, many years. Richard Watson Gilder and his wife Helena were active in the arts and literature and education in New York, and they owned the Four Brooks Farm in Tyringham. And they invited many well-known people to visit them up in their Tyringham farm, one of whom was a famous portrait painter named Cecilia Beau, and the other was President Grover and Francis Cleveland. So these are photographs. This is Grover Cleveland fishing on Lower Goose Pond. This is Mrs. Cleveland and Cecilia Beau sitting on rocks on Goose Pond. This is my property, which I'm so excited I found these rocks. And this is Grover Cleveland in 1906. He had lost a lot of weight because he had a gastric problem, and his wife. and Richard Watson Gilder and Cecilia Bow here. This is also my property. For those of you unfamiliar with Cecilia Bow, her work hangs at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. This is Richard Watson Gilder portrait and some others that she did. I thought she's just a beautiful painter. So here's Grover Cleveland and Richard Watson Gilder in a boat on Lower Goose Pond in 1901. And you might ask, what was it like fishing on Goose Pond with a former president of the United States? And we know the answer to this because Richard Watson Gilder published a book called Grover Cleveland, A Record of Friendship in 1910. And he wrote, "It was a strange experience when off alone with the ex-president in a rowboat on some secluded sheet of water, to hear one's fishing companion, while skillfully getting ready his tackle, talk with inside knowledge and in phrases as graphic as they were homely, of great international events in which he was himself a leading actor, and naming unostentatiously some of the leading living characters of the world. When he fell into reminiscences of this sort, it was apparently without any sense whatever of his own historic importance. I have never seen such unconsciousness." And he wrote this, "When fishing, he, Cleveland, limited the number of fish caught with a view to some reasonable use, and he killed his fish as soon as they were caught." And Grover Cleveland himself wrote this in a letter to an unknown recipient in 1898. "And then, too, I am a fisherman, and never doubt a fish story that another fisherman tells." And that's what we got. So I'll take some questions or comments if anybody has any. I jumped ahead here. I don't want to do that yet. Afterwards, I do have books for sale. For those of you who want them, they're $50, which is $10 off of retail. We accept a number of different payments, and my wife will take payments, and then I'm happy to sign them and inscribe them for you. If you don't want to buy a book today and you want one, they're available. The Lenox Bookstore has them in stock. You can also buy them on Amazon, or you can order them in bookstores, and you can borrow it from the Lee Library. You know where that is. And also the Tyringham, Lenox, and Great Barrington libraries. And again, all profits are donated to the Upper Goose Pond hiker cabin, which operates still. And then feel free to take a picture of that if you want. You can feel free to email me if you ever have questions or comments, or if you want to buy books. And thank you very much. Question, yes.
Yeah, could you say something about how the effects of GE and the PCB have affected Goose Pond in any way?
As far as I know, it hasn't had any effect.
Oh.
And we've been fortunate because Goose Pond is at such a high elevation. There's no runoff from the valley level or from the river because we're well above that. We're 500 feet above it in altitude, so it hasn't affected it.
That's great.
It is great. And we have no zebra mussels, which is also great. Yes.
I had heard that some of the families that were left in Upper Goose Pond, the state had given them a certain number of years before they had to.
That's correct.
Get kicked off their own property.
Right.
And it was the right of eminent domain that they had.
Well, so it's interesting. So there were several different families. So the Murphy family, which was the one that had the smaller house near the channel, were a little bit resistant to the sale to the National Park Service. They held out a little bit, and they ended up with just a 25-year lease that they were allowed to stay for 25 more years. So they had to leave their property around 2007, and the cabin was demolished. Okay, the Stillwells, the Stevenson Stillwell cabin, the one that still operates, when they sold their large tract of land to the National Park Service, they got a 50-year lease, so they're still using that cabin to this day.
Well, I've seen them on
You've seen them up there, right? So they have.
Anyway.
What's that?
They're descendants anyway.
Correct. And they're still called Stillwells. Yeah, I know them very well. Their lease is up, I think, in 2031, and so what's going to happen to those cabins has not been decided yet.
did they financially, were they pleased with the final?
Good question. Yes, they really were. They really wanted to do this. They really were very dedicated to the long-term preservation of Upper Goose Pond, and it was a very amicable. I mean, obviously there was a negotiation that went on for a number of years because it was a big transaction, but the family were actually very enthusiastic about it, and they still feel very positive about it.
So you have land?
I do.
Oh, so you can have land there, or is?
Not on Upper Goose Pond.
Oh, okay, you're on the.
I'm on Lower Goose Pond.
Okay.
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
So you focused, I'm sure your book covers all kinds of things, but you focused today on the industrial history of the pond. So I live on George Cannon Road, which is right off Goose Pond Road, which everybody knows is the extension when you should get to Tyringham. Forest Street becomes Goose Pond Road. So, and I had always heard the story that George Cannon, who had been part of the Shakers over on the other side of the valley, you know, fell in love with a fellow Shaker, was kicked out of the community, crossed over and settled over there by near Goose Pond. I mean, his house was right on where my property is. You know, you can see the remains of it actually. So, did the Shaker, is there a pre-industrial history of this lake that's human? I mean, were people interested in it before it was mills? Or was
Yes. So first of all, I never heard that story about George Cannon, so that's really interesting.
I've
So
forgotten where I
so
heard
I
it.
might have to have you write the chapter for the second edition.
No, he didn't move
but-
to Goose Pond,
yeah, but
we're pretty much
yeah.
across the street.
The Shakers were definitely around. The information on Shakers on Goose Pond is kind of thin, okay? But there is a chapter on the Shakers in the book, and there is a reference from, I think it was the Rogers Mud Pond book, if I'm not mistaken. It talked about how the Shakers were early residents around Goose Pond, and I do have two. You can look at the Shaker chapter. There's 2 plots of land at the far end of Upper Goose Pond that did belong to Shakers. I don't know if there were houses there or if they were just woodlots. But there were Shakers. There was definitely a Shaker presence around Goose Pond, but the information on it is still pretty thin.
Yeah.
But certainly in Tyringham, there was a large Shaker community.
yes.
We know that.
Right, they were part of it, and then they were kicked out, is what I heard.
Yeah.
Which, you know, it could be just a war.
Yeah, I don't have more details on it than that.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm curious, why was it the National Park Service that came in and organized the purchasing of the land as opposed to a Commonwealth or county government or trustees or
Yeah,
whatever?
great. Yeah, I didn't go into that in the talk. In 1978, the U.S. Congress passed the lay term for it is the Appalachian Trail Act. It had another name. And it called for the federal purchase of a 1,000-foot wide corridor of land throughout the entire Appalachian Trail from Georgia to Maine. And some areas that was done by the Department of the Interior, and other parts by another department. I'm blocking which one that is. So anyway, but the area around here fell to the National Park Service. So it was a federal congressional act. It was signed by Jimmy Carter to purchase the land. So the purchase of Upper Goose Pond was all part and parcel of that larger purchase.
Was it Agriculture and the Forest Service that was the other department?
Yes, I think that's right. Yes, I think that's right. I couldn't remember.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jay.
There's no documentation in terms of how the name changed from Lake May to Goose Pond?
It was not really an official thing, I don't think. So, and I think the way I gather it is that even when it was called Lake May, it didn't really give up its name, Goose Pond. So it was kind of two parallel naming situations. But I think by the time I think the early 1900s, like maybe the 1920s, well, they still called it Lake May Power. So I think as you get into the early to mid 1900s, I think the term Lake May kind of disappeared. But I don't think it was an official name change. Yeah.
What's the difference between a lake and a pond?
Well, I mentioned that question in the book. but I defer my whole conversation to a book by R.W. Smith. Did you ever see The Three Thumbnails? I don't know if, Michelle, if we have that is she here? Look for the book Three Thumbnails. It's a cute little wonderful book about, R.W. Smith was a Lee resident, and he wrote this book, and one chapter was on Goose Pond. And he talks for several pages about pond versus lake. I don't think he really resolves it, but it's very entertaining. So I don't have an answer for you. Yes.
I was intrigued early on when you talked about the source of material for the paper. Why did the Berkshires have so many rags?
Only that there wasn't anybody else buying them yet. In other words, in Boston and in New York, paper mills were buying the rags, and so there was so much competition for it. But I think that we all probably have rags in our garages, okay? And so we all create rags, but until there's a market for it, everybody's got a lot of them. So I think it's just that nobody had gone after them yet. I don't think that we were any messier than anywhere else. Yes?
There's a small island on Upper Goose Pond. Is there any history to that?
There is actually. There's a really interesting story that called about a death that occurred in Upper Goose Pond back in 1822, and allegedly the drownings that took place were two men that fell off of what is now called Elwell Rock, which is on the island now. If you read my book, I'll poke some holes in some of that legend, which is that there was an Indian involved. But there is a grave on Goose Pond still that you can see in the woods that holds the remains of at least one person who drowned, who allegedly fell from that island. The other thing I can say about the island is that there's a concrete pedestal on there. Have you seen it? And so that's still there. There's a concrete pedestal on the top of the rock on the island. This is on Upper Goose Pond, has one island. And that's what he's asking about. So that pedestal was constructed in the 1930s by one of the Stilwell family, who they built their own telescope. They ground their own lenses. They made the whole thing by scratch. And then they mounted the pedestal on the island. So at that time there were no trees on it, and they could look at the stars and the planets. So that pedestal is still there. That's all I really know about the island. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, everybody.